Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Very glad to have you with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Just 5 days now until Election Day. We have good, and crazy martinis for you today. Double-fisted, in fact, on the crazy martini, and certainly a whiff of bad there as well. Jim, let's begin with the latest in the Senate polling. We know what the Republicans need to do, assuming they don't lose any seats that they currently hold, in order to gain the majority. They need to win West Virginia, which seems very, very likely right now with Jim Justice. And they seem to have a solid advantage in the Montana Senate race. John Tester's been a survivor before, but Tim Sheehy seems to be beating him consistently in the polling out there. So we'll see if that ends up being the case. But they'll also hope to maybe pick up Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan. It would be a stretch, I think, but certainly a possibility. And then there's, the seats they need to defend. Right now, Ted Cruz in the latest poll is up 4 on Colin Allred. Rick Scott's up 5 on Debbie Murcassel-Powell. And then the race we've talked about periodically in Nebraska, and that is where Deb Fischer has been in a very tight race with Dan Osborne, who is technically an independent, but as you've pointed out many times, supporter of Bernie Sanders. So I guess in the sense that Bernie Sanders is an independent most of the time, except when he's running for president. Yeah, he's an independent, but not in between the two parties like most people normally think of it. So it seems like Nebraska voters have finally figured that out. In the latest Economist YouGov poll, Deb Fischer at that very important 50% mark, with Dan Osborne now 7 points behind at 43%. There's 2 Senate races because there was a special election after the resignation of Ben Sasse a couple of years back. Ricketts, the sitting senator, at 54%, his opponent at 36%. So it looks like voters are shifting more Republican in the Cornhusker state as we get closer and closer to Election Day. And if that's the case, Jim, not only is that good because it makes things less complicated for Republicans in trying to get to the majority, but it proves one of your longtime theories.
So if people feel like our podcast or the Morning Jolt newsletter or anything else that I write or contribute has covered the Nebraska Senate race, or the state actually has 2 Senate races this year, but has covered this race excessively. I'm not going to say when and where, but I was on another podcast with a left of center contributor, and I'd said something like, well, actually, the Senate's looking pretty good for Republicans at this point. And this was a little while ago. And the left of center contributor, who shall remain nameless, said, Deb Fischer's in real trouble out in Nebraska. There's a very good chance this independent named Dan Osborne beats her. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the gist. And I pride myself on being on top of things like this. And I had not heard anything that like, whoa, wait, what? So I go digging into it. And the first thing is that there are up until very recently, there were no independent polls conducted of the Senate race. You only had polls commissioned by the 2 campaigns. And I know this is going to shock you listeners, but the polls commissioned by Dan Osborne showed him ahead, said he was doing great, or that he was, gaining right behind her, and unsurprisingly, polls commissioned by the campaign of incumbent Republican Deb Fischer showed her ahead, generally by a couple of points. Well, we've had 2 independent polls since then. The first one by New York Times Siena, which came out earlier this week, had her up by 2 percentage points, 48-46. Not great if you're an incumbent. You'd like to be above 50, but you'd rather be ahead by 2 than down by 2. And now a new one out by The Economist has her up by 7, 50% to 43%. That's about what I would expect. You could generally say Deb Fischer is going to run behind Trump. Probably going to run behind Ricketts, the former governor who's in that other Senate race. She doesn't have the highest name ID. She doesn't have the highest profile. There's a certain amount of vulnerability there, but this is still a state that Trump's going to win by 15 percentage points on the low end, 20 percentage points on the high end. You just don't see Democrats winning in circumstances like that very often. So I've just kept an eye on this. And once you start looking, every major publication has done an independent, about to pull off the upset of the century in this deep red, Republican state. Now, as people say, whenever there's a question in the headline, the answer is always no. In this case, no. She'll probably win by a smaller margin than we're used to seeing a Republican win in a red state. But that's kind of, and Beto did better than Democrats usually do up against Ted Cruz. He still lost by 3 percentage points, raising more money than any Senate candidate had up to that point in history. and with more gushing, glowing national press coverage than any other Senate candidate had ever gotten. 2 years later, South Carolina, a state I know pretty darn well. Jamie Harrison was going to beat Lindsey Graham, remember? Oh, it's coming. This is going to be the upset of the century. And of course, Lindsey Graham won by about 10 percentage points. Every cycle, we get some Democrat running in a red state, usually against a Republican that Democrats hate, like Ted Cruz, like Lindsey Graham. Go further back to Allison Lundgren Grimes up against Mitch McConnell. Greg, you're old enough to remember when she was going to give Mitch McConnell the race of his life. that he won 56% to 40. So not like, if that's the race of your life, you've had it really easy for a really long time. You don't have to worry about it too much. So it's this same phenomenon that we see every cycle. And I get kind of annoyed. Like, Daily Kos wants to write this sort of thing. Fine. Rolling Stone, I'm just happy when they don't have a terrorist on the cover with dreamy, soft focus, that's a big win. Or some pop star half naked. Like, those are our options usually for Rolling Stone covers. But I expect a bit more, even from NBC, even from, I don't think the New York Times. Like, if you want to write a profile on a long shot Democratic candidate, go right ahead. If you want to write a profile of a long shot Republican candidate, go right ahead. Just don't mislead your audience into believing this thing is, tight as a tick and could go either way. And if this comes to pass, if Deb Fischer wins, as I expect she will, then the Osborne campaign will have managed to generate all of this national coverage simply by releasing internal polls, which I think we all take with a certain grain of salt. Way to go, professional journalism. Way to go.
You just said tight as a tick. Do you realize you just quoted Dan Rather?
I know. Yeah, I know. Tight as a mite. Tight as... Look, Dan Rather, parasites, those just go together in my mind. So, blood-sucking.
So let me offer you a little bit of insight on this. I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. If the Democratic Party doesn't really have a nominee and there's an independent in the race, that's their candidate.
Yes.
This isn't rocket science. All right, Jim, on to our second good martini now. And, if you look at the polling, everything's razor thin in all the major battleground states and even the national polls, which really don't matter, although the Trump campaign would love to win the popular vote and take that argument away from the Democrats if he's able to win the Electoral College. But everything's within the margin of error in these critical states. The betting markets, however, seem to be looking very strong for Donald Trump, almost by a 2-to-1 margin now. But we'll find out how significant the betting markets actually are once this is all said and done. Don't forget, the betting markets also said the Colts will beat the Jets in Super Bowl III. The betting markets aren't always right. So get yourselves in gear and get voters to the polls if you really want to win. But another sign that things aren't going all that great for the Democrats is that the blame game of a potential Harris loss is already spilling out publicly, which is not where you want to be several days before Election Day. But nonetheless, that's where we are. And Amy Parnes, writing over at The Hill, and Amy Parnes was one of the co-authors of the Shattered book, I believe, following the 2016 election. The early post-game excuses and blame game for Harris are a number of things. Number one, it appears that they think that not having a normal process, Jim, actually would end up costing them if, in fact, she loses. So she wasn't in the primary. She was selected, not elected. The removal of Biden, all that upheaval, perhaps did not have voters, particularly persuadable voters, looking very fondly or favorably towards the Democratic Party. Also, the other big thing in here is that Tim Walz, just as you said, even before this election was made, not the strongest choice she could have made. And especially if she loses Pennsylvania, that's going to look like a major, major blunder along the way.
Yeah, first of all, I don't know if Parnes is working on another book, but I get the feeling, let's leak to her just in case. Don't blame me for this mess. Today's Morning Jolt, I kind of walked through all the early vote numbers, all the polling averages, both Real Clear Politics and 538, which, oh, by the way, there's not that much of a difference between the two. If you want to see a Trump win, right now, no toss-ups. He's he's ahead in, I think, all the Sun Belt states. The early vote in Nevada is looking great, continuing. Like a 40,000 vote lead in terms of registered Republicans against registered Democrats. If you're Trump, you'll take that every day of the week. And he's currently leading very narrowly in Pennsylvania. Now, to give you a sense of how tight as a tick, as Rather would say. If you take Harris's numbers in the Real Clear Politics average and just increase them by 1 percentage point, not the highest, not a terribly high bar to clear, she would win the blue wall states, she would win Nevada, and North Carolina would be a toss-up. It'd be 49-49 or something like that. So, not as good as it looks for Trump, it's not that far out of it. So I kind of feel like out of all the scenarios that could happen, a Harris landslide feels really unlikely at this point. A Trump landslide doesn't feel all that likely either, but that's just one of those scenarios. And a lot of Democrats would have said, particularly back in the days of joy and coconut tree memes and all that stuff, they would have expected that she was going to, win by a wide margin, and she was going to put this thing away. And everybody loved Coach Tim Walz and all that stuff. And I think, the fact that there's this preemptive blame game, this preemptive spin that, hey, the loss wasn't my fault, that to me says to me, that's, again, it's like the body language of the campaign. I think Democrats are very nervous, and I think they should be very nervous. The preemptive blame game, look, a lot of it is going to end up on Joe Biden, and deservedly so. He was too old to run for another term. Everybody could see he was going to be too old for another term. After the midterms had gone pretty well for his party, even though they lost the House, Biden should have said, I'm only going to serve one term. He should have let his party have a real primary. Whether the nominee turned out to be Harris, whether the nominee turned out to be somebody else, that nominee would be in better shape than Biden was. And the Biden, and the people around him were in denial about his mental state, his health, his energy level, and all of that. He goes out, he's the worst, has a terrible debate. And then after he has a terrible debate and every Democrat could see, oh God, this guy's not going to win, they had weeks of pulling teeth and arm twisting and all that kind of stuff to get him out, which again, only weakened the party, only made the party look incompetent. And, Harris gets in. I actually don't think Harris has run that bad a campaign considering the circumstances. She is a very flawed candidate. I know I'm the guy who said she's easily underestimated, but I just gotta, she turns in a lot of word salad. She's flawed, but I also think she has certain offsetting strengths. And I think, one of the offsetting strengths is that no matter how much of an idiot you think she is, she's got everybody on the left side of the aisle pulling out all the stops, staying up late, doing everything possible to make her the next president. So she still has this ability to make people utterly convinced that they need her to win, whether or not she's actually a good candidate. So I look at all that, and the fact that they're blaming that, I think that, people, the moment she loses, people will turn on her, and you'll hear people who are insisting that she's a great candidate say that she's a terrible candidate. And remember, it's never the Democratic message that can fail. It's only the Democratic messengers. I actually don't think she's that bad a candidate, as I said, and I think the problem is, as they say in that old joke, the dogs just don't want to eat the dog food. The electorate just does not want the product. It's not the advertising campaign, it's the product. And also, just kind of alluding to Tim Walz. Look, Biden won by nearly 8 points last time around, and she's leading by 5 or 6 points now. So with Tim Walz on the ticket, they can't do as well as they did last time. We'll see how the final number. Maybe they do better than they expect. But remember all that talk Tim Walz was going to help her in the blue wall states? Didn't do it at all. I think he was a goofball who was a knucklehead, in his own words, who was in over his head, not ready for prime time, not ready for national campaigning, didn't make the most of his opportunity on the debate stage, and who's kind of come across as a hapless, a guy who's perfectly well situated to be the blue state governor, not ready to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. So we'll see how it shakes out. But there's going to be an epic finger pointing if Harris does not win. And even if she, as I think it's possible, she wins by the skin of her teeth, there'll be a decent amount of finger pointing saying, did she, would picking Shapiro have helped her in a state like Pennsylvania? Spoiler alert, yes.
Yeah, I don't know how it's going to turn out. It could be one of these things that goes for days. It could be one of these things where, like you see in a lot of even midterm elections, where just there's a little bit of momentum, a couple of points in each state, and then almost all of the battleground states end up going one way or the other. But if she loses, I feel like once you shove Joe Biden out, there's really no other option. They kind of had to go with her, but there were some risks in doing that, and I think that's why you saw Barack and Michelle Obama hang back. Biden announced he was leaving on the race on a Sunday, and it wasn't until Friday where the Obamas did that awkward phone call with her. That was their endorsement of her. Between the word salads and the fact that she has to defend the Biden record despite trying to claim that she's the candidate of change. A lot of weird things about this race for sure when it comes to Kamala Harris. All right, so as we get into our double-fisted crazy martini here, Jim, you've got the actual voting We've seen most of the campaigning. Got a few days left of that. The ads and everything else that a bunch of sleep-deprived people have put together here in the home stretch of the campaign. And now it comes to the actual get out the vote, the counting of the votes. And when you're doing that, you want a system that people can consider secure and reliable and on the up and up. In a number of different places around the country, we're seeing stories that just grind your gears because a lot of this seems to be preventable, avoidable news that cast doubt then on the reliability of the election. Just in passing, there's the story out in Colorado of the Secretary of State whose office publicly posted a spreadsheet with one of the 2 passwords needed to program voting machines. So that's not good. But let's move to 2 other states, Michigan and then Washington. In Michigan, and this is an issue that goes beyond Michigan, Dominion machines apparently aren't working properly, at least when it comes to people who want to vote straight party. Here is Jocelyn Benson, not one of my favorite people, and along with Whitmer and Dana Nessel, the kind of the troika of lousy Democratic statewide leaders. But here's her response to the Dominion issue.
Yeah, this is a nationwide issue with Dominion voter access terminals in the counties that use them. And the voter access terminals, of course, not all the machines, just the ones that are accessible, have an issue with the straight party voting and a programming issue that's, again, affected the machines nationwide. And I think all of us that use Dominion machines were unhappy to learn about this during the testing period and as early voting began. So we're working with Dominion to seek accountability on that front, and also are working with our clerks to ensure voters are aware of this programming issue that will require them to ensure they are voting every section on the ballot.
Jim, it's the same thing with the paper in Arizona a couple of years ago. It probably won't make the difference, but how do you not test these things? How do you not make sure all the gremlins are out of the system? You've had 2 years since the midterms, 4 years since the last presidential election, and these things keep popping up in states where the margin of difference could be razor thin. We'll get to Washington State in just a second, but what do you make of the Dominion issue?
Well, Greg, before we go any further, to all of Dominion's lawyers, all we are doing, Greg and I, is quoting the Michigan Secretary of State, who's a Democrat. We're not saying anything's hacked. We're not saying as far as we know, you guys are awesome. You're doing swell. It's just an issue with the straight party voters. It's only with the early vote machines that have been used so far. No one's saying the vote totals have been changed. Nobody stay home from voting or stuff. I just want to make sure we cover our bases on that one there, Greg. No, look, this is really annoying. And as you said, you figure you test and retest this kind of stuff. A whole bunch of states went through big sweeping changes to try to, make sure everybody had the budget they needed, everybody had the time and the head start that they needed. Why is this a problem? Why is this an issue? I'd love to do that. Asking the question is not libelous, it's not scandalous, it's not anything like that. But and maybe I'd be less let me say the other, ironically, also in Michigan, separate issue. Just yesterday, they announced that a Chinese student who is in the country legally as a student, but who is not a U.S. citizen and therefore not able to vote, cast a ballot in Michigan. And they cannot get it out because once you vote, once you put it into the machine, there's nothing that ties that ballot to you. It ties it to that precinct. They can get it there. So we know which batch a fraudulent ballot or a vote that should not be counted. We know which one it's in. We don't know who this candidate is, who this Chinese student had voted for. I said, well, just ask him before you deport his butt back to China. But somebody pointed out that it's conceivable this person would lie. And then if you took out that vote based on who he said he had voted for, well, now they've done it twice. Now they've heard it twice. So it's a little annoying that there's no, I understand why the anonymity of the ballot, the secrecy of the ballot is why once you cast it, there's nothing that ties that ballot to you personally. On the other hand, we now see the consequences of that. We should point out, again, this is, as far as we know, one vote by one person that was not legally eligible to vote and cast a ballot. As they were quick to emphasize when they put out announced the indictment, it is rare. Rare does not mean non-existent, and I don't think the state of Michigan will come down to one vote. It's very unlikely. There's going to be millions of people. But we did see it come down to a couple hundred in Florida a couple years ago, so it's not crazy and unthinkable that this election could be voted. You got to stop this stuff beforehand, and it's really infuriating But hey, Greg, what's going on in these other states?
It's almost like you should have proof of citizenship when you register to vote.
Right? Yeah, you did with the University of Michigan, ID. You don't have to be a U.S. citizen to get a university ID. Why is that enough?
All right, let's go to Washington State. We've seen reports like this, I think, in other cycles as well. But this is a lady in King County, Washington. That's where Seattle is. She just moved into a new 2-bedroom apartment. And let's just say her mailbox has been fuller than it should be the last few days.
On Friday, Jamie Visaya says she went down to check her mailbox.
There was about 9 voter registration ballots that were not mine. So I thought that was strange. So I ended up returning them to the post office here.
But to her surprise,
Again, last night,
there was another stack in there. This time, 7 different ballots.
long name Mohammed, last name Mustafa.
She only lives in a 2-bedroom apartment. Most of the ballots are addressed to different last names, but all have one thing in common: her unit number.
Management said no one's lived here for 3 months.
Maybe the people who were registered at her apartment before didn't update their address through USPS when they moved. But still, Visaya wonders,
Why didn't I get all of their other mail forwarded here, or junk mail, or anything like that?
And so then the TV station put this woman in touch with the King County Elections Chief of Staff named Kendall Hodson, who thought that the best thing would be for the county to just collect the ballots. But then when there was further inquiry about what to do in this situation, here's what Hodson said.
Hodson also told us, quote, even if someone gets a second ballot or more, whether under their name or someone else's, we'll only ever count 1 ballot per registered voter with their matching signature.
Yeah, but if they all have different names, that's just 1 ballot for each name. So then you got to really scrutinize the signatures. So, Jim, 16 different ballots, seemingly with all different names in the same location. Again, not inspiring confidence.
No, and when they said voter registration ballots in the opening words of that TV report,
She meant ballots as the story later said. Yeah,
there are several steps. One is if a party or an organization wants to send out invitations to apply for an absentee ballot, I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. I don't love it, but it's one of those things where, like, yeah, fine. You want to tell people, hey, you have the opportunity to get an absentee ballot. Here's how you do it. Very little harm in that. If you want to send out absentee ballot request forms, I think it gets into a little bit of a shakier area. But then fine. But here's the problem. It's actual ballots, and that worries me more. It's one of those things where I want ballots to be under the control of authorities as much as possible. And I guess if you're going to do it by mail, okay, then it's going to have to be in the mail, getting it to the person who can't vote on election day. And you got to make it, then it's going to get on the mail, getting back to the ballot counters before election day. Although apparently in Nevada, you can do it a couple of days later. No postmark, no problems. No shirt, no shoes, no problem or out in Nevada. And so the fact that these are actual, what is to stop that woman from saying, I think Mustafa would have voted for Trump this year and filling it out? Because it's already on file. That's how she got the ballot out there, right? Thankfully, this is an honest person. I hope that there's an honest person. I think the point about how, if you're thinking, somebody forgot to fill out a change of address form or something. Okay, except why, as you said, why do you not get junk mail? Why are you not getting magazine subscriptions? I'm just kidding. Nobody subscribes to paper magazines anymore, and we're a poorer culture for it. But that doesn't make sense. And that does sound like someone who's been ballot harvesting or something like that. Why all these at one address? It's very much in the vein of, it is the much more serious mail ballot equivalent of your and my cell phones belonging to Diane and Deborah. Diane and Deborah have been a phenomenally popular part of this podcast.
Doris.
I'm sorry, Diane and Doris. It's all D names. Diane and Doris, separate from us, got a $1 billion deal from Netflix last week. I don't understand what's going on here, but apparently people love that much more than our podcast. There's every time this happens, is it happening on a scale for an election to be stolen? Probably not, but this, it's like that saying of the shark. You only know about the shark fins you see. You only know about the cases where somebody comes forward and says, "Oh, this is really bad. I've got 17 legal ballots in the state of Wisconsin, all ended up in my mailbox, and 16 of them don't live here." That's a real problem that you'd like to see the state jumping on. And when you see people like, the Biden administration saying in the state of Virginia, no, you can't take these people off the Virginia voter race. And no, giving them a provisional ballot is not a sufficient remedy so they can start out and prove their citizenship. It makes you think that something, there are some shenanigans going on.
It's again the left refusing to clean up voter rolls at best. And how 16 people, all with different last names, ended up at the same location. Even if you just do the absentee ballot request, all those people obviously shouldn't still be in that location. So you need to be constantly cleaning up those rolls and keeping a very close eye on it. And as long as we're talking here, Jocelyn Benson, Michigan Secretary of State, and I'm sure you're a regular listener, take me off the rolls. I've been gone for over a quarter of a century. Please, I'm begging. Anyway, Jim, happy Thursday. I'll see you on Friday.
See you Friday, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to our podcast if you don't already. Tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Thursday and join us again on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.